No, it's a pleasure to be here, to hear 5 really interesting and quite demanding talks on what are really very important issues. A little bit of history. When I was learning economics, standard textbooks in the 1960s on economics said little or nothing about nature and natural resources. Economic processes were depicted as broadly linear. You could picture a sort of box. On the left-hand side, it said capital, labour and land. And then there was an arrow to another box which said production, and an arrow to another box which said consumption. And that was the economic process. No recognition that we were using the environment as a source of natural resources, as a source of natural beauty, and indeed as a repository and waste sink for the residuals of our economic and other activities. Now, it's not that economists actually hadn't thought about such issues, they had. And although macroeconomists depicted what they called the circular flow of income, there really wasn't the active recognition amongst the majority of economists, and some of you might say there still isn't, that the economy and the environment were interconnected and mutually dependent. And this kind of thinking did change, and it began to percolate in a different way in the 1970s and the 80s and on. But in economics, as we've been warned long ago by John Maynard Keynes, many people of today continue to be influenced by the scribblings of some defunct economists. And there are defunct engineers and others who also play the same part, particularly for those of us who were trained a long time ago and may not have retrained ourselves since. Old ideas are very powerful. Of course, some economists had been concerned about resource depletion. There were worries about coal depletion in the 19th century, and of course worries about peak oil, peak gas in the 20th century. But really, the thinking about nature-based solutions across a wide spread of academic disciplines, and indeed not just the thinking amongst various academic disciplines, often siloed, but also some policymakers. The thinking about NBS is by and large a most welcome and very recent development, not for everybody, but for a lot of people, and including, I would say, the growing emphasis on the potential for nature-based solutions to provide a set of co-benefits to urban areas, whether they're growing areas or areas in decline. And we've seen excellent examples of that given today. But that complexity of those interactions actually brings big problems for existing regulatory and evaluation systems, which actually don't always embrace the complexity and indeed the co-benefits. So I'll come back to that. I was going to give you some slides from a couple of recent European projects, but there isn't time. I might put them back on the slides that will be available after the presentation. I'd rather talk about what people have been saying this afternoon. But just to say something about Wales, I mean, Wales, which built its economy and shaped its society through the exploitation of certain kinds of natural resources, coal, copper, iron, and indeed the use of the seas to export all these products all over the world, now has excellent opportunities to work with other renewable natural resources and people, especially people, in ways that build on these modern understandings of our interdependencies with nature and the opportunities both to respect it and to learn from it. So we began with Louise Noring, and that was a very helpful introduction, I think, in many ways. And she drew our attention to global challenges faced in cities, not just those in Wales and the United Kingdom, but the huge concerns in the developing and minority world in relation to a whole number of challenges: demographic, economic, rising sea levels, and, of course, the issue of policy distortions. And actually the lack of recognition in policy from many valuable ecosystem services, for example, remains a challenge in trying to make sure that we get the kinds of investments that would be useful to us. Louise gave us a good explanation of these global stresses and the challenges, and she illustrated how and why certain kinds of nature-based solutions might be particularly appropriate to meet challenges that cities face. She did say, and Cynnal Cymru also said, that a lot of the solutions are low-tech or less costly and cheaper than the grey-techy solutions. It was later qualified to some extent by saying a lot of them are cheaper overall, but not necessarily cheaper on the initial investment, which is been a big issue. And one of the problems, I'm sure, for a lot of nature-based solutions is that some of them will prove more costly in the short run, and they're essentially, many of them, long-run focused. And they won't pass investment tests unless the criteria are broader than narrowly specified economic rates of return. And that's a real challenge. I had an example last week in relation to, I was reviewing a PhD which was looking at district heating. And a body in the Department of Energy and Climate Change, the Heat Network Development Unit, actually provides funds for local authorities to work with commercial consultants to actually use a technique known as heat mapping. But the heat mapping technology and software that is about today actually produces evaluations of commercial rates of return. What it doesn't include are some of the other factors and reasons why local authorities might want to undertake these kinds of investments in district heating. You can argue about the benefits and disbenefits if you want to later about district heating. But one of the things that's very important for many local authorities is what might district heating do in relation to alleviating fuel poverty, and what might it do in relation to possibly improving not only people's comfort but their health, particularly that of old people. Now, if you don't have those kinds of criteria factored into the evaluation technologies and into the decision making and into the regulations, that's a big challenge, I would suggest. So we move on to Cynnal Cymru, and that was excellent, inspiring, and he did give us good examples of multifunctionality and the challenges of actually getting different disciplines to work together, and not just academic disciplines, but different people, planners, commercial firms, government, and so on. And he gave nice illustrations of the idea of actually having a goal-driven implementation matrix, which would embrace some of the range of objectives that you might have, as well as acknowledging the interdependencies between the various different elements in any nature-based solution, and the kind of complex co-benefits that you might want to factor into the whole process. He emphasized synergy benefits and interactions, suggested that we do need this multi-criteria approach to project development, evaluation and implementation, and talked about the blue-green dream, and made the comment that this should be, the innovations should work from the common people to the Prime Minister. And one of the things which is often emphasized, possibly not the Prime Minister, that is some Prime Ministers, but the thing that is emphasized in a lot of nature-based solutions is actually that if they're really going to work, they do require the participation of citizens, small groups and others who actually buy into these schemes, and can also help ensure that the designs are not of a kind which actually cause disbenefits to people. I mean, you can improve certain areas of cities, but if in doing so you gentrify them in such a way that you drive some members of the community out of where they are, where they were but now can't afford to live, then you've got a real challenge, and those kinds of issues do clearly need to be addressed. Just a very brief comment, something Louise said earlier on about driverless cars, that with driverless cars we'll only need 9% of the cars. I'm a bit skeptical about that, I have to say, because if the driverless cars are so wonderful and so fantastic, I think we'll want more of them. I mean, I have to say, if you look back into the history, when the fluorescent tube was developed, the electricity manufacturers in the US were really concerned because electricity demand would go down because they were so much more efficient. Of course, that didn't happen. They didn't actually succeed in their opposition, but what they worked out, which for them was actually quite a clever solution, was to ensure that the lighting regulations were tightened up and raised, so that actually people did have to want to have more light. There's possibly a message there. Okay. Duncan and Macquarie on green chemistry. I found that really fascinating, as I did the rest of the talks, and it gave illustrations of things that we probably wouldn't really ourselves be aware of or would have thought, and it raised particularly the really big issue of waste. And the question of what is waste, and the fact that what waste is varies from society, from time to time, and varies tremendously indeed according to income. I always remember my brother was studying agriculture, and I remember asking him, because he'd been doing a lot of plant identification, but what do you define as a weed? And the sort of clever words in the agriculture profession at that time were, a weed is a plant in the wrong place. And you can sort of see something analogous to that with waste. What is actually defined as waste varies tremendously. I did research in India for a couple of years, and I had a waste paper basket, but there was almost nothing in it except modern packaging, because somebody came to the door of the postgraduate hostel where I was living at the time every week and bought my newspapers from me. Somebody else came and bought bottles. There weren't many bottles, but they were bought. So whether or not things are waste and whether or not they're actually used depends tremendously on a variety of cultural and economic conditions. And one of the challenges for us now is to recognize that actually depicting things as waste is often really not helpful in thinking about how they can most effectively be used. And we had lots of lovely examples from Duncan, which I thought were really interesting, from orange peel to seaweed. And really, I think, probably made me and a number of the rest of us think, as indeed did his raising of questions about the sustainability of particular rare elements and the kinds of things that you could do with them. My only concern about harvesting, it sounds like a really good idea, harvesting some of the elements of palladium and other things that come out of catalysts. On the other hand, if that actually gives permission to the industry, which perhaps it wouldn't because they'll get the stuff back, to continue broadcasting some of these elements across our soils, where they may well be ingested in our waters, then that's actually not a great idea. But he's not suggesting that. Ian Bryden gave us an excellent presentation of the ups and downs of marine renewable energy and its past and prospective achievements and challenges, and particularly not just the technical engineering challenges, but the political and economic and especially environmental challenges, as well as those technical engineering challenges. And I think we can safely say he's not a strong candidate for the Donald Trump Award for services to coastal golf. He was very frank about the challenges and the opportunities of wave and tidal energy, and gave us an excellent feel for how to think about the undoubted complexities of developing marine renewable energy. But of course, we do have to remember that one of the reasons new energy technologies coming forward are rightly challenged is because today they're subjected to a much richer and wider set of evaluation criteria, particularly in relation to the environment and possibly to a lesser extent in relation to social impacts than earlier technologies were. And there are big challenges for developing new technologies. Ian ended by giving us a good feel for the potential next stages that are necessary for both technical and funding development to help marine renewable energy move along and down the learning curve, which is essential if it is to become broadly competitive with other forms of energy, with or without appropriate externality charging. And he raised this problem of sustained funding streams, and the danger, particularly at the moment in this country and possibly in other countries, but certainly in this country, of there being a perceived lack of firmness of direction in relation to a number of these areas. Renewable energy is a very good example of that, actually, where contradictory messages have been tending to come out, where it's clear that different parts of the government and indeed the Conservative Party have very different views on what is appropriate, inappropriate, and so on. And that's really a challenge for developing things which are a long way from commerciality and where the long view is really important. Because if we take the short view, then there are many technologies which would never have got to the point and will never get to the point where they get down their learning curves sufficiently to be competitive with those things which have had many years to be established at scale, to learn from their previous mistakes and disasters and get there. And he ended with a nice little conundrum for us to ponder, a nice throwaway comment also about the sociology of energy. And I do think it's very clear, and excellent work here in Wales and at Cardiff in particular on the social and psychological side of energy, is actually showing us the complexity that's involved if we're trying to get ourselves and other people around us to actually think about energy in new ways, to use new technologies. How many people actually would be comfortable if we turn up and say, actually, I know you like your gas boiler, but it won't do. It's got to go. And they have got to go. Carolyn Roberts ended with, again, a wide-ranging talk on innovation and nature-based approaches to water management. She put a nice focus on innovation in the water sector and industry, and actually showed us that what we tend to think of, for those of us outsiders who don't know much about the water sector or industry, that actually it's much more complex than we might imagine, and that complexity brings real challenges in actually bringing it together, not least because of the diversity of understandings and views of the performance of the industry, what innovation means to the industry, and how to get to the various different places that people actually want to get to. So actually developing kind of coherent understanding here is a very big one. She referred to the 2009 Cave Review of Innovation in Water, which suggested that all was not well since the privatization of water. And I would make the comment that I think both energy and, I suspect, water privatizations, at the time they were done, they tended seriously to underestimate the challenges of long-term infrastructure investment and environmental quality. In the energy field, the early regulation of energy in both electricity and gas really was very much focused on delivering the kinds of benefits that the government of the day saw in terms of what consumers would get. And it was sort of assumed that somehow the long-term investment would happen, and we know, we've seen that that's a very big problem in terms of the kinds of network investments that we need today. And they also just didn't really pay much attention to the environmental issues and have been sort of backfilling it ever since. And one of the things we've seen out of that is that actually the attempt to assume that, or say the assumption that the private sector would be, with a little bit of appropriate regulation, will be able to handle all of these issues, has actually turned out not to be the case. And what we've seen in recent years, as governments have signed up to a number of rightly challenging objectives in relation to climate change, for example, is increased intervention from the state as the state tries to ensure that some of these things that we're committed to actually do get delivered in a situation where the private sector doesn't necessarily have the incentives to do the kinds of things that are really important in societal terms, not just now, but in the long term future. But some nice reflections on the 2007 flooding and the messages that came out of that. Raised the question, what if it's all a big hoax? And actually that is quite serious in the sense that that there are quite a lot of people who are actually quite open to that kind of argument, and therefore would tend to think that actually it's not worth doing very much. We just muddle on very nicely. And Carolyn ended by I think with giving us a good idea of the way in which resilience requires various forms of innovation, and I think gave a good idea of the kinds of challenges that are there for innovation, and her water innovation spectrum showed us the range of things that actually need to be done and integrated if everything's going to work. So one of the things that came out of one of the EU projects that I was going to tell you about but won't, thank God, was a suggestion that for nature-based solutions, it's really important. One of the things that's really important is that people actually know about them and hear about them. And so there's been a suggestion. It's a very nice Euro suggestion, typical one in some ways, and there's some good things about some of those suggestions, I think, too, is that actually what are needed are ambassadors for nature-based solutions. And I would like to suggest that we heard 5 excellent ambassadors for nature-based solutions this afternoon. Thank you very much.